I caught my billionaire father trying to secretly pay my pregnant wife to disappear forever, but what she pulled out of her pocket shocked everyone. Elias Thorne almost didn't come home early that night, and if he hadn't, none of this would have come out the way it did. His distributor meetings in Chicago wrapped a day ahead of schedule, and instead of sitting in another hotel room, he booked an earlier flight home to Sonoma County. His wife, Nora Vance, was 7 months pregnant, and every trip away from her lately felt harder to justify than the last one. He landed at San Francisco International, loaded his bag into his Range Rover, and drove north until the skyline gave way to oak trees and vineyard rows. The Thorne family estate sat at the end of a long gravel drive, 3 generations of reputation built into stone chimneys and a wraparound porch. Rows of vines stretching out in every direction under a sky just starting to go dark. He'd grown up in this house. He knew every creak in the floorboards, which was exactly why the ones coming from the west wing that night caught his attention at all. He let himself in quietly through the side door, not wanting to wake the house. And that's when he heard it. Voices coming from the study. His father's voice, flat and controlled. The same tone Richard Thorne used when he was closing a deal he had no intention of losing. And under it, steady but tight, his wife's voice. Elias stopped in the hallway, his hand still on the strap of his bag. Something about the rhythm of it told him this wasn't small talk. He moved closer to the half-open door and looked in. Richard sat behind the same oak desk where he'd signed 1,000 contracts over the decades, a manila folder open in front of him. Across from him stood Nora, one hand resting over the curve of her belly. "This is a generous offer, Nora," Richard said, sliding a stack of papers toward her. "More generous than you deserve, given the circumstances. Sign it, and be gone before that child is born." Elias's stomach dropped. He should have walked in right then. Instead, some instinct told him to wait, to hear the rest first. And what he heard over the next few minutes would change how he saw his own family for the rest of his life. But to understand how a 7 months pregnant woman ended up standing her ground against the most powerful man in Sonoma County wine country, you have to go back to the day Elias fell in love with a woman his father never wanted him to marry. Richard Thorne built Thorne Valley Vineyards from 100 acres of dirt into a wine country institution, poured at state dinners, name-dropped by sommeliers from Napa to New York. He was ruthless in negotiations and allergic to sentiment. And he had exactly one heir to leave it all to. Elias remembered the first time he understood exactly what his father was capable of, long before Nora ever entered the picture. He was maybe 12, trailing Richard through a negotiation with the owners of a small family vineyard 2 properties over, a couple in their 60s who'd fallen behind on a loan Richard's bank contacts had quietly steered them into a year earlier. Richard bought their land for 1/3 of what it was worth, thanked them for their years of good neighborliness, and drove home whistling. "That's business," he told Elias in the car when his son asked why the couple had looked like they were about to cry. "You'll understand when you're older." Elias did understand, eventually, just not in the way his father meant. He grew up groomed for the job before he ever got a vote in it. Private schools, an MBA he pursued out of obligation more than interest. Weekends spent shadowing his father through vineyard tours instead of playing Little League. By 30, he was president and chief operating officer, running the company day to day while Richard hovered over every decision like a man who'd never learned to let go. Then he met Nora Vance at a wine industry fundraiser in San Francisco, the kind of black tie event he usually endured rather than enjoyed. She was there representing a small viticulture history nonprofit, giving a talk about the laborers and small investors who built California wine country and never got their names on a bottle. Something she said stuck with him for weeks afterward, that history remembers the man who signs the check and forgets the man who did the work. He introduced himself after her talk. She was sharp, funny in a dry way that caught him off guard, and completely unimpressed by the Thorne name, which, frankly, was a relief. They married within a year, in a small ceremony Richard attended but clearly did not enjoy. From the start, his disapproval of Nora was never loud. It was worse than loud. It showed up in small, deliberate ways. Her name left off formal invitations. Richard asking Elias detailed questions about yields and contracts at dinner while looking straight past Nora like she wasn't in the room. One dinner in particular stuck with Elias for years afterward, long before he understood why it mattered. Nora had brought up, gently, a piece she wanted to pitch to a wine magazine about the vineyard's early history. Richard set his fork down without looking at her. "That's not really your department, is it?" Nora tried again. "I just think there's a good story in it. The people who actually built this place." "The people who built this place," Richard said, "are sitting at this table." Elias remembered laughing it off that night, the way you laugh off a joke that isn't actually a joke, because looking at his father squarely would have meant admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. When Nora asked about turning a guest cottage into an office for her consulting work, Richard vetoed it within the hour, citing structural concerns that never seemed to apply to anyone else's projects. Nora brought her frustrations to Elias more than once. She felt isolated out at the estate, especially when he traveled, which was often. She felt like a guest in her own home. "That's just how my father is," Elias would tell her, kissing her forehead, changing the subject. "He'll come around once the baby's here." He told himself he was keeping the peace. What he was actually doing was leaving her to absorb his father's coldness alone, while he told himself the business needed him more. There were entire weeks, especially late in her second trimester, when Nora barely left the main house. She started eating dinner alone in the kitchen rather than sit through another meal of Richard's clipped, one-word answers. She took long walks through the vineyard rows by herself in the late afternoons, telling herself it was good for her, when really it was the only part of the estate that didn't feel like it belonged to someone who wished she'd never shown up. When Nora got pregnant, something in Richard shifted, but not the way anyone expected. He didn't warm up. If anything, his attention sharpened into something colder, like the pregnancy had tripped some alarm inside him. He started asking Elias pointed questions about contingency planning and protecting the family's interests. Elias assumed his father meant trust funds. He had no idea Richard meant something else entirely. Back in the hallway, Elias watched his father slide the folder further across the desk. "You're asking me to sell my silence," Nora said. Her voice didn't shake. If anything, it had gone quiet in a way that was worse than shouting. "You want me gone before my daughter's even born, and you think a check fixes that?" "I'm asking you to be reasonable," Richard said. $3 million, Nora. Structured payments, a non-disclosure agreement, and you walk away with more security than you've ever had. Elias will be provided for separately. In time, you'll see, this was the smart move. "And if I don't sign?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Then things get a lot less pleasant for everyone." Nora didn't reach for the pen. She rested her hand on her belly instead and looked him dead in the eye. "I'm not for sale, Richard, and neither is my daughter." Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Elias, still frozen in the hallway, felt something hot climb up his chest, somewhere between fury and disbelief. His father wasn't just being cold. His father was trying to pay his pregnant wife to disappear, like she was a liability on a balance sheet. Richard leaned back, his composure slipping at the edges. "You don't understand what you're standing in the middle of." "No," Nora said. "I think I understand exactly what I'm standing in the middle of." She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled something out. Small, metal, worn smooth with age. She set it on the desk between them. A pocket watch, old and silver, the kind of thing that gets passed down and never gets thrown away. Elias couldn't see the details from the hallway, but he didn't need to, because of what it did to his father's face. Richard's color drained out fast enough that Elias thought, for a second, his father might actually need to sit down, despite already being seated. In 32 years, Elias had never once seen his father look afraid of anything. Not a bad harvest, not a lawsuit, not a market downturn. He looked afraid now. "Where did you get that?" Richard said. And for the first time all night, he didn't sound cold. He sounded scared. "You know exactly where I got it," Nora said quietly. "It was my father's." That was Elias's breaking point. Whatever had kept him in the hallway let go all at once. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, and both his father and his wife turned to look at him like he'd walked in holding a gun. "Somebody better tell me what the hell is going on in this room," Elias said. Nora's shoulders eased slightly at the sight of him, though her hand never left her belly. Richard straightened up and tried, badly, to pull himself back together. "Elias, you're early." "Clearly," Elias said, stepping in, his eyes moving from the contract to the watch and back. "What is this?" "A private family matter," Richard said. "One that doesn't concern you." "She's my wife," Elias said. "That's my daughter. Everything about this concerns me." So somebody explained the $3 million contract on this desk. And somebody explained why my father just went white as a sheet over a pocket watch. Nora answered first, her eyes still on Richard, watching him the way you watch something that might still bite. "This watch belonged to my father, Thomas Vance." The name meant nothing to Elias. "I don't know who that is." "No," Nora said, "you wouldn't, because your father made sure of that." Richard's hands were shaking slightly against the desk now. "This is ancient history. It has no bearing on—" "Tell him," Nora cut in, "or I will." A long silence stretched out. Outside, the wind moved through the vines. Finally, Richard exhaled, and something in him seemed to give out. "Thomas Vance," he said slowly, "was one of the original investors in this vineyard. Back when it was 100 acres of dirt your grandfather and I could barely afford." Elias felt the floor tilt under him. One of the original investors. As in, a partner? He put up capital. He knew soil, irrigation, winemaking better than either of us did back then. He held 15%. And where is he now? "He died," Nora said. "When I was a teenager. Cancer, fast-moving. And somewhere in his last few months, while he was in a hospital bed fighting for his life, the ownership records for this vineyard got quietly rewritten." She looked at Richard. "His name came off the deed. His shares came off the ledgers. By the time he died, according to this family's paperwork, Thomas Vance never owned a square foot of this place." Elias looked at his father, really looked at him, searching for some trace of the man who taught him to ride a bike on this same gravel drive, and found only a stranger sitting very still behind an old desk. "Is that true?" Richard didn't answer, and in a family built on cold silences, that silence was a confession all on its own. "I did what was necessary to protect this family's legacy," Richard finally said, though it came out brittle, nothing like his usual commanding tone. Thomas was gone. His claim would have dragged the estate through years of complications. I simplified things. "You stole from a dying man," Elias said, the words landing like a physical blow as he said them. "You stole from someone who couldn't fight back, and you've spent 30 years pretending it never happened." "Elias, and now you're trying to buy his daughter off with money built on top of the fraud." Richard opened his mouth, probably reaching for some version of the speech he'd rehearsed 100 times about protecting the business, the bloodline, the legacy. Nothing came out. There was no version of this that didn't end with him as the villain, and for the first time in his life, he seemed to understand that. Nora picked the watch back up, closing her fingers around it the way you hold the last piece of someone you've lost. She looked at Elias, steady, though he could see the exhaustion underneath it. "I'm not signing anything," she said, "and I'm not staying here another night." "Nora, I need to go," she said, not unkindly. "Not because I'm running from you, because our daughter needs to be somewhere that doesn't feel like a war zone." Elias wanted to close the distance and ask her to stay so they could sort it out together, right there. Something stopped him. This wasn't the moment to ask her to stay for his comfort. This was the moment to let her protect herself and their daughter, the way she'd been doing alone for longer than he'd realized. For a moment he thought about going after her right then, saying something, anything, to close the distance before she reached the front door. He stayed where he was instead, rooted to the same spot in the study where he just learned more about his own family in 10 minutes than in 32 years of living in it. He watched her walk out, chin up, hand never leaving her belly, and felt something in his chest cave in. Every time she'd told him she felt isolated, every time she'd mentioned his father's coldness, and he'd waved it off with a kiss and a "he'll come around," he hadn't been keeping the peace. He'd been leaving her to face it alone. She didn't call Elias again that night. Instead, she called her older sister, Claire Vance, from a gas station parking lot 20 minutes down the highway, her hands still shaking hard enough that she had to set the phone down on the passenger seat and put it on speaker. "I'm okay," she told Claire, which wasn't entirely true. "I just need somewhere to stay for a few days." "You don't have to explain anything right now," Claire said. "Just drive here. I'll leave the porch light on." Nora pressed her palm flat against her belly and let herself cry for exactly as long as it took to merge back onto the highway. And then she made herself stop, because crying wouldn't get her anywhere, and her daughter needed her steady. Elias stood at the study window a long while after her taillights disappeared past the oaks, his father's silence pressing in behind him like a wall closing off any way back. Nobody saw what came next coming. Or maybe, given who Richard Thorne was, everyone should have. By the next morning, a story had gone up on the Valley Insider, a regional gossip site that covered wine country scandal like sport. The headline alone turned Elias's stomach. Thorne family turmoil. Pregnant daughter-in-law storms out after financial demands rejected. The article, sourced to an unnamed family insider, painted Nora as an opportunist who'd married into money and grown resentful when the family patriarch wouldn't meet her escalating demands. It called her erratic and quoted the source saying the family was devastated but not surprised. Nora read it twice from Claire's kitchen table, a room that didn't belong to anyone named Thorne. She didn't cry this time. She'd half expected something like this, if she was honest with herself, though expecting it didn't make the words on the screen sting any less. She closed her laptop, pressed her hand against her belly, and said out loud, to no one, that none of it was true. The way you remind yourself of something you already know, but need to hear anyway. Elias read the same article twice, hands shaking, before the truth of it settled over him. There was exactly one person with the motive, the media contacts, and the complete absence of a conscience required to smear a 7 months pregnant woman the morning after she fled a house where she'd just been offered hush money. He found Richard in the dining room, eating breakfast like nothing had happened. "You leaked this," Elias said, dropping his phone on the table. Richard didn't look up from his coffee. "I'm protecting the family's reputation. Once she starts talking, and she will, we needed to control the story first." "Control the story," Elias repeated. "You're smearing the mother of your grandchild to cover up a fraud you committed 30 years ago." "I'm doing what needs to be done," Richard said, finally meeting his eyes, no apology in them at all. "Someday you'll understand that protecting this family means making hard calls." Elias stared at the man who raised him and felt something finish breaking that had only cracked the night before. This wasn't strength. It never had been. This was a man who'd built an empire on a lie and was now willing to burn his own son's marriage down to keep it buried a little longer. "You should be very careful," Elias said quietly, "about what you think I understand." That night, unable to sleep, Elias called the one person outside the family he trusted enough to be honest with, his old college roommate turned attorney, Marcus Webb, and laid out the whole mess over the phone at midnight. "If even half of what you're telling me is true," Marcus said, "you're not looking at a family disagreement anymore, Elias. You're looking at a fraud case with your name attached to it, whether you want it there or not." "I know," Elias said. "So what do I do?" "You start documenting everything. Tonight, before he has time to clean anything up." While the story ricocheted through wine industry forums and local group chats, Nora did something nobody expected, least of all Richard. She didn't fight fire with fire. She called a lawyer. Daniel Reyes had a reputation as one of the sharper family law attorneys in San Francisco, known for handling high-asset cases without losing his cool. Within a day, Nora sat across from him laying out the timeline calmly. the pocket watch resting on the table beside her like evidence she intended to protect. "I don't want to burn anyone in the press," she told him. "I want the truth on record, and I want my daughter safe. That's it." Reyes leaned back and studied her for a moment. "You understand that once we file anything formal, this becomes very public, very fast." "It already is public," Nora said. "Just not with my version of it." "Fair enough," he said. "Then let's make sure your version is the one that holds up." He slid a legal pad across the table. "Tell me everything, in order, starting with the first time you felt unwelcome in that house. Don't leave anything out because you think it sounds small. Small things are usually where these cases are won." Reyes helped her draft a short public statement. It went out that afternoon, and it was notable for what it didn't contain. No insults. No accusations thrown back at Richard. "Recent reports about my departure from the Thorne estate have mischaracterized both my intentions and my character," it read, in part. "I won't be responding to speculation from unnamed sources. My focus is on my daughter's health, and on honoring the truth about my father's legacy, a truth that's been buried for far too long. I have nothing further to add." It was short, it was graceful, and it did more damage to Richard than his own smear campaign, because it made Nora look exactly like what she was, a woman with nothing to hide, standing calm in the middle of a storm someone else started. Within hours, the tone online started to shift. People stopped repeating the tabloid story and started asking who this family insider actually was, and why the article never produced a shred of evidence for Nora's supposed demands. Nobody had answers yet, but the doubt was growing, and it was growing in exactly the wrong direction for Richard Thorne. A few longtime distributors, the kind of people who'd been pouring Thorne Valley wine at their own tasting counters for 20 years, quietly reached out to Elias directly instead of commenting publicly, asking if there was anything to the story or if it was just noise. He didn't answer any of them yet. He didn't have enough to say. That night, back at Claire's apartment, Nora allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to be furious, pacing the small kitchen with one hand pressed to her lower back, before she made herself stop, breathe, and go to bed. Anger wouldn't get her anywhere, not with a lawyer just hired and a due date 10 weeks out. Getting the truth on paper would. Elias wasn't interested in a PR battle. He wanted the truth, all of it. The morning after the article broke, he walked into the Thorne Valley Vineyards offices and had the company's IT director cut his father's access to every internal system tied to the business. No shouting, just a quiet, surgical severing of Richard's ability to touch anything he'd spent his life building. "You can't lock me out of my own company," Richard said, storming into Elias's office an hour later, composure fully gone now. "As of this morning, I can," Elias said, not looking up. "I've got full authority during an active internal investigation. And as of 9 a.m., we're officially investigating irregularities in the property and ownership records of this vineyard." Richard's face went through 3 colors. "You have no idea what you're unraveling." "Then start telling me the truth," Elias said, meeting his eyes, "before an outside auditor finds it without you." By the end of that first day, word came back through the company's general counsel, Angela Cho, that Richard had already retained his own outside attorney and was threatening to file an injunction to halt the audit entirely, arguing Elias had exceeded his authority as chief operating officer. "Can he actually do that?" Elias asked her. "Maybe," Angela said, "if a judge agrees the investigation is retaliatory instead of warranted, which is exactly why whatever the auditor finds needs to be airtight before this gets anywhere near a courtroom." For about 6 hours, it was a real possibility that the whole investigation could get shut down before it started. Then Priya Malhotra called with the first document. Malhotra, of Meridian Forensic Accounting, arrived within 48 hours with a reputation for untangling exactly this kind of decades-old ownership mess. And once her team started pulling files, the injunction talk quietly disappeared. While her team worked through the financial records, Elias went looking for anyone who might remember Thomas Vance firsthand, and found Hugh Callahan, the estate's foreman of nearly 40 years. "You knew him," Elias said, watching the older man study a faded photograph. Hugh nodded slowly. "Good man. Knew more about soil chemistry than half the consultants your father hired later. Thomas is the reason the North Slope produces what it does. Your father knew it too. Everybody who worked this land back then knew it." "Then why did nobody ever say anything?" Hugh's face went heavy. Before he could answer, Richard appeared in the doorway of the equipment barn, having clearly followed Elias out there. "Hugh, a word." Elias stayed rooted where he was, close enough to hear every syllable. "Whatever you're about to tell my son," Richard said, low and even, "I'd think hard about it. You've got a pension riding on this place. 38 years of it. Careless talk has a way of costing people things they can't get back." Hugh didn't flinch, but his jaw worked for a second before he spoke. "You said something real close to that to me once before, Richard. 30 years ago. I listened then." He turned back to Elias like Richard wasn't even standing there anymore. "I'm done listening." Richard's face went rigid, and he walked off without another word. Hugh let out a slow breath. 2 of the men who worked with Thomas back then got let go the year after he died. Called it budget cuts. Nobody believed that, but everybody understood it well enough to keep their mouths shut afterward. I've got a family too, and I told myself for 30 years that staying quiet was the smart move. I'm not proud of that, but I'm telling you everything I know now, for whatever it's worth this late. "It's worth a great deal," Elias said. "And whatever happens with your pension, Hugh, that's on me now, not him. You have my word." Hugh just nodded, like a man setting down something heavy after a very long time carrying it. That same week, Elias drove into the city for the first time since Nora left. Not for the investigation, but because she'd asked if he wanted to come to her next ultrasound appointment. He sat in the waiting room feeling more like a stranger than a husband, and when the technician pointed out their daughter's heartbeat on the screen, steady and fast, Nora reached over without looking at him and took his hand, just for a moment, before letting go. Neither of them said anything about what it meant. Neither of them needed to. 4 days later, Priya Malhotra called an urgent meeting, a thick binder of documents spread across the table. "We found the original partnership agreement," she said, sliding over a photocopy, the typewritten text faded but legible, dated nearly 4 decades back. 3 signatures at the bottom, Elias's grandfather, a young Richard Thorne, and Thomas Vance, listed clearly at 15% ownership. "This is real," Elias said, running his fingers over the signatures. "It's real, and it's binding," Malhotra confirmed. "But it's not the version on file with the county. That one, filed 2 years later, shows only 2 partners. Vance's name and his stake are just gone." "How does that happen?" "Badly, in this case," she said, pulling out a second set of papers. "Whoever refiled this forged the notarization, and not well. The seal doesn't match any notary registered in the county during that period. And there's a lump sum payment in the bank records around the same time, structured to look like a buyout. Except Thomas Vance never signed a buyout agreement. We ran the signature 3 separate ways. It's not his." She tapped a third folder. "And there's a gap in the property tax filings the year after. Thomas Vance should have shown up as a lien holder on record. He never does. Either nobody checked for 30 years, or somebody made sure nobody would want to." Elias sat back, the weight of it landing all at once. His father hadn't just let an old partnership quietly fade. He'd forged records while a dying man was too weak to fight, faked a buyout to cover the theft, and built 30 years of reputation on top of it. "There's one more thing," Malhotra said, softer now. "The watch your wife showed your father. Can I see it?" Elias called Nora that evening, the first real conversation they'd had since she left, and she agreed to bring the watch in the next day. When the forensic team opened the back casing, they found what Thomas Vance had hidden there decades earlier. A folded scrap of paper referencing Partnership Clause 12 and the 15% stake, tucked beside a small photograph of Thomas standing in the vineyard rows next to a much younger Richard, both of them smiling, from an era before any of this had happened. Underneath the clause number, in handwriting gone soft with age, Thomas had written 4 more words, meant for no one but himself at the time. Don't let them forget. Elias stared at those 4 words longer than he stared at anything else in the binder. He held the photograph next, quiet for a moment. His father, maybe 25 in the picture, was smiling in a way Elias didn't think he'd ever actually seen in person. Not once. Not in 30-some years of Sunday dinners and boardroom meetings. "He looks happy," Elias said. "They both do." Malhotra didn't answer right away. "Sometimes that's the hardest part of this job," she finally said. "Finding proof that the person doing the stealing actually cared about the person he stole from, once. It doesn't make it better. It just makes it sadder." Thomas Vance had known something might happen to his official records even before he died, and he'd left the proof inside the one object he knew his daughter would keep for the rest of her life. "In 30 years doing this work," Malhotra told Elias, closing the binder, "I've seen a handful of cases this clean. Your father left a paper trail because he never thought anyone would come looking hard enough to find it." Elias called an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. The room was full, every seat taken, and the tension had nothing to do with quarterly numbers. Diane Whitfield, the board chair, called it to order and gave Elias the floor. Richard sat at the far end, jaw set, having learned only that morning what the meeting was about. Elias stood. "4 weeks ago, I overheard my father offer my pregnant wife $3 million to leave this family and disappear before our daughter was born. I want you to understand that before we go any further, because everything else explains why." He walked them through it, the original partnership agreement, the forged filing, the fake buyout with a signature that didn't match, the bank records, the note and photograph hidden inside a pocket watch a dying man had protected with his last strength. "My father didn't just cut a partner out of a deal 30 years ago, Elias said, sliding copies down the table. He committed fraud against a man who couldn't defend himself, stole a 15% stake that belonged to the Vance family, and built this company's reputation on top of that theft. When his daughter-in-law showed up with the evidence, he tried to buy her silence. When that failed, he smeared her in the press." Richard found his voice. "This is a family matter being turned into a boardroom coup." "This is fraud," Diane said flatly. "Documented 40 years back, with forensic accounting behind every word of it." Richard looked past her to the rest of the table. "And what exactly do you all think happens to this company's stock price when word gets out that the board gutted its own chairman over a family dispute?" "What happens to the stock price," Diane said, "is considerably less our concern than what happens to this board's credibility if we're shown to have known about fraud and done nothing. Those are not close calls, Richard." Not everyone at the table moved as quickly as Diane did. Grace Liu, who had joined the board only 2 years earlier and had always found Richard difficult but competent, asked the question nobody else wanted to ask out loud. "Is there any chance this is overstated? I'm not defending anything I'm hearing. I just want to be sure we're not ending a man's career over an accusation that might not hold up to what a court actually requires." "It's not overstated," Priya Malhotra said from a seat near the back of the room. "I've built my career finding gray areas in situations like this."
There isn't one here.
Grace sat with that for a moment, then nodded slowly. Walter Higgins, who'd sat on the board almost as long as Richard had run the company, raised a hand next. "Before we vote on anything, I want to understand our exposure here. If this comes out in litigation, are we looking at the company's liability or just Richard's?" "Both, potentially," Diane said. "Which is exactly why sitting on this any longer isn't an option." Walter sat back, quiet for a moment, clearly working through it, then nodded once, slow. "Then let's get it over with." Richard tried one more time, straightening his jacket, some of his old polish coming back into his voice. "Every one of you at this table has benefited from decisions I made over 30 years. The deals, the expansions, the reputation this label carries in every market in the country. Weigh that against a mistake made decades ago." "A mistake is an accounting error," Diane said. "What you're describing is a forged document used to strip a dying man of what he earned. 30 years of silence to protect it. A payoff attempt when his daughter showed up with proof, and a defamation campaign when that didn't work. There's no version of this board's responsibility that looks past that, Richard. Not for 30 years of good vintages. He tried Grace Liu next, the newest member, the one he'd personally recommended for the seat 2 years earlier. She looked back at him with something that might have been pity and said nothing at all. Richard looked around the table for one sympathetic face and didn't find one. The vote came back unanimous. Richard Thorne was stripped of the chairmanship, removed from all operational oversight, and the board authorized legal proceedings to restore the Vance family's ownership stake to Nora, and eventually, her daughter. Security walked him out within the hour. Elias didn't go back to the estate that night. He drove into the city and asked Nora to meet him at a small cafe near Union Square, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and no connection to the Thorne name at all. She was staying with Claire for now, close enough that Elias could see her when she wanted, far enough that the estate couldn't reach her. She was already seated when he got there, one hand resting on her belly out of habit, watching him with an expression that was careful but not closed off. "I'm not asking you to come back to the estate," he said, sitting down before she could brace for it. "That house doesn't feel safe to you, and after everything, I don't think it should." Her shoulders eased a little. "That's not what I expected you to say." "I've had a lot of time to think about what I actually owe you," Elias said. "It's not an apartment on the estate. It's boundaries, real ones. My father doesn't get access to you or our daughter again. Not at holidays, not ever. I'll put it in writing if that's what it takes." Nora studied him. "And trust? Because you brushed me off for months, Elias. Every time I told you something felt wrong out there, you told me to be patient." "I know," he said, and didn't try to soften it. "I told myself I was keeping the peace. I wasn't. I was just leaving you to deal with him by yourself. And I'm not going to pretend that didn't cost you something. I don't expect you to trust me just because I finally did the right thing once the truth came out. That gets earned back slowly, and I'm ready to do that for as long as it takes." Something in Nora's face softened, not into forgiveness, not yet, but the door hadn't shut either. "Okay," she said quietly. "Slowly then." "What happens to the vineyard now?" Nora asked, turning her coffee cup slowly between her hands. "I don't know yet," Elias admitted. "I know I don't want to run it the way he did. I know your father's name belongs on something real there, not just a line in a settlement. Past that, I'm figuring it out as I go." "That's the first honest answer you've given me in probably a year," Nora said, and for the first time that afternoon, something close to a smile crossed her face. They sat there a while longer, past the point where the conversation needed to keep going, because neither of them was in a hurry to walk back out into a world that hadn't settled yet. He asked about the pregnancy, how she'd been sleeping, how the doctor's visits had gone without him there. Ordinary questions, the kind a husband should have been asking all along, and the kind that, for the first time in months, she actually wanted to answer. Before he left, he told her about the ultrasound appointment he still thought about, the sound of their daughter's heartbeat filling that small room, and how it had made him angrier than anything else about what his father had tried to do. The idea that Richard had wanted that sound to belong to a life Elias would never get to be part of. Months passed. The legal proceedings wrapped quietly, restoring the Vance family's ownership stake and formally correcting 3 decades of falsified county records. Richard, stripped of his role and facing separate civil liability, disappeared from public life, his name conspicuously absent from every mention of the vineyard he'd once run like a kingdom. On a warm afternoon in early autumn, the main hall at Thorn Valley Vineyards reopened after a careful renovation, its history told in full for the first time. A small crowd gathered near the entrance. Elias and Nora stood together, their newborn daughter, Everly Vance Thorne, asleep against Nora's shoulder. Hugh Callahan stood nearby, uncharacteristically emotional for a man who'd spent 40 years unbothered by California heat and everything else. A bronze plaque had been mounted beside the entrance, catching the late afternoon light. It read, in honor of Thomas Vance, founding architect and co-investor of Thorn Valley Vineyards, whose vision shaped this land and whose legacy is now, finally, fully restored. Below it, a second line announced the Thomas Vance Foundation, a scholarship fund for aspiring viticulture students and vineyard workers' children across Sonoma County, funded in part by Nora's restored stake. Nora reached out and touched the plaque, tracing her father's name where it had been erased from every official record of the place he helped build for 30 years. Hugh cleared his throat and stepped forward, holding a small wooden box he'd clearly been saving for this exact moment. Inside, on faded velvet, sat a handful of old photographs Elias had never seen. Thomas Vance walking the vineyard rows in shirt sleeves, kneeling beside young vines, laughing with Elias's grandfather over an early vintage. "Thought the foundation might want these," Hugh said, gruff, clearly uncomfortable with how much feeling had crept into his voice. "Man deserves to be remembered as more than just a name on a plaque." One of the first names on the Foundation's scholarship list that fall was Sofia Delgado, 19 years old, the daughter of a longtime cellar hand, who cried when she got the call and later said it was the first time in her life anyone outside her own family had told her that the work her father did actually mattered. Nora insisted on making that call herself, rather than handing it off to a committee. It felt, she said, like the truest use of a name that had spent 30 years being denied the credit it was owed. Sophia cried on the phone, and then she laughed and told Nora her grandfather used to talk about a man named Thomas who taught him everything he knew about the vines, though nobody in the family had ever known his last name until now. Later that evening, after the crowd had thinned and the caterers had packed up the folding chairs, Elias found Nora standing alone at the edge of the vineyard, Everly finally asleep in her arms, the sky over the hills gone orange and gold. "Your father would have liked this," Elias said, coming to stand beside her. "He would have liked the wine more," Nora said and laughed, quiet and tired and real, the first easy laugh Elias had heard from her in almost a year. She was quiet for a moment, watching the last light move across the vines. "I used to walk out here almost every afternoon, back when I still lived in that house," she said. "It was the only place that felt like mine. I didn't know until today that it actually was." The family's future, whatever shape it eventually took, was finally being built on something solid. Not silence, just the truth, in bronze, impossible to erase twice.
What would you do if you discovered your own family built their wealth on a massive lie? Let me know in the comments, and do not forget to like and subscribe.